The tribe says, hit the like. Bill Thimis 4426 says greetings.
Greetings and welcome to Inductive Logic, Strengths and Weakness of Arguments. Continuing with our book review from The Power of Logic. And with that said, let's get right down to it. So we've gone through some of the major chapters. As it is a graduate level book, it probably goes a little too intensive into the whole topic of logic, more for an ethics or philosophy or law major. However, I figured I'd take out the ones that seem to be the most prominent to our daily lives and bring it forth in these presentations. And right now we're getting on to inductive logic. So that said, let's get into it. So with our introduction to inductive logic starts with our definition. It's the study of methods for evaluating arguments for strengths and weaknesses. Key words here. So let's look at some of the key points. Contrast it with deductive logic. It focuses on strengths and weaknesses, not validity and invalidity, as in deductive logic. And of course, deductive logic works on the formal rules of formal logic as opposed to informal logic, which we're more involved with here, dealing with language. And inductive logic is much I guess say less developed because relatively less has developed than with deductive logic, being that deductive logic works through a lot of symbology and has been pretty much mapped out with a lot of absolutes that are not determined on other factors, which we'll see in inductive logic. So the effective tests for strengths and weaknesses are more elusive than validity tests, and that's key. So deductive logic just has to worry about validity. Is it a valid structure? But strengths and weaknesses are quite elusive, as we'll soon find out. Okay, so let's look at some comparisons between inductive logic and deductive logic. Inductive logic works on probability. The outcome, the conclusion is probable, but not necessary. There are degrees of strength. Strength comes in degrees. It's not absolute. Deductive logic, however, works with certainty. There's a necessary connection. Without it, there's no connection. It's necessary. It's absolute. It's all or nothing. Validity is binary. There's no degrees of validity. It's either valid or invalid. So let's look at the definition of a strong argument. As we said, it's strengths and weaknesses. So a strong argument, how can we define that? A strong argument is probable, but not necessary, otherwise it'd be valid, that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So it is probable, but not necessary, that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. If it's unlikely that premises are true, given that a conclusion is false. So here's one thing here. It's unlikely that the premises are true, given that a conclusion is false. So you can see how this works in that direction. And a conclusion of a cogent argument can still be false. So we're going to get to that in just a moment too, but here's a key point. Well, first, a cogent argument can have a false conclusion. It's something we want to keep in mind, but here's a key point. The strength does not require certainty, only probability. So the strength, again, as opposed from being valid, which is absolute, strength is probability. And we'll get into that in much more detail. And cogent arguments. Let's move along here. I thought we had the cogent argument. Cogent argument where all the premises are true, but let's move along here for our examples and start to work our way to get more of a grasp of how this, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, especially with cars. So the argument here is 90% of the cars in the parking lot were vandalized last night. Second premise is my car was in the parking lot. Conclusion is my car was vandalized last night. So the analysis here is this argument is strong because it's probable, 90%, that the conclusion follows from the premises. But if the conclusion is false, if your car wasn't vandalized, the argument remains strong. Your car was among the 10%. See? So if we take the 90% were vandalized and your car was in a parking lot, but we don't know if you're part of the 90% or the 10%. That's key, but it's not easy to see from the way the argument's presented. So this is a key insight here. If the conclusion was false, the argument remains strong. Your car was among the 10%. We could say 10% of the cars in the parking lot were not vandalized, and my car was not vandalized. So let's move along. And definitely want to pay attention because at the end we're going to have a special surprise, and for those that stay for that, we'll have an extra special treat at the very end that applies to this inductive logic in an electronic and musical sense. So definitely stay tuned to the end. Let's go over with the strength and validity and how they compare. So our key contrast between the strength versus validity. The validity, again, it's binary. It's all or nothing. It does not come in degrees. Strength, however, comes in degrees. It can be more or less strong, like an odor. Illustration here is increasing strength. So 90%, that's strong. Say 90% were vandalized. But if you said 99% were vandalized, then that's even stronger. So as we can see here is a quantification of strength. And that's a key aspect of strength, being able to be quantified in some sense because it goes by degree. That implies a quantity. So increasing the percentage makes the argument stronger. The conclusion becomes more probable. So again, probability, not absolutes. So we have statistical syllogisms in the form. So syllogism is the forms we were looking at there. You know, if all A's are all A's are B or sorry, if never mind. Let's look at what they got here. Here's our general form: X% of A are B. Our second premise is C is an A, so therefore C is a B. So this is a general form, but this is a statistical syllogism, where our other syllogisms would be an absolute premise here in our formal logical statement. So, or deductive logical statement based on symbology that would find in formal logic. So if it was in one of the common forms or famous forms, then it would be easy to see. But here we've substituted in here a percent. So a percent of A or B. And we would say C is an A. Therefore, C is a B. So if subset C is an A, then a certain percentage of A's are B. So C is a B, but that's a percentage. But let's look at this now. So it's a syllogism, but it's not a strict syllogism. It's a statistical. So this is implying that there's a percentage here or some type of statistical numerical addition here to qualify it as being a syllogism in place of the binary deductive logic statement. So let's see here. The requirements for a statistical syllogism. Key here is the percentage range. It must be between 50 and 100 exclusive in the percentage range. It must be between 50% and 100 exclusive. So what does exclusive means? It means it excludes 50 and 100. So the percentage range key here now to be a statistical syllogism, and we'll see why. This simple little thing here makes a big difference. 50.000001, or whatever you want to say. It's a hypothetical here. It has to be at least that, and it cannot be 100. It could be 99.9999999.
Bill Famous 4426 says more likely than not.
Yeah, more likely than not. And that's what we're getting into in just a second, because by having a quantity, we need to also understand that we're implying a lot more than just a small little sliver, but the whole way it's being interpreted more often than not, or is it just a coin toss, in which case it's really a baseline. And I want you to keep in mind the idea of that baseline. So 50 was almost the zero. So 50% would be a 0% statistical syllogism, because you could say, it's a toss-up, so there's really no argument, it's moot. But having it at 100 also makes it absolute, in which case you would have a valid argument. So again, we're talking about in the inductive sense, it would be a statistical syllogism only if it's between 50 and 100 percentage range, exclusive, meaning not 50 and not 100. So we have boundary cases. Okay, so now if it's less than 50, on the other side, it's a weak argument. And if it equals 100, again, it's a valid argument. All A's are B. If it's exactly 50, then it's not an argument at all. Let's move along. So statistical syllogisms. Here we have an example argument. 95% of women over 30 years of age cannot run the mile in under 5 minutes. Second premise, Rebecca is a woman over 30 years of age. The conclusion is, hence, Rebecca cannot run the mile in under 5 minutes. So 95%, I'd say it's pretty, 5-minute mile is pretty good. But she's over 30 years of age, and they say 95% according to this argument. So hence, Rebecca cannot run the mile in under 5 minutes. So here's our variable assignment. Let's look at it this way. A is women over 30. B, cannot run the mile under 5 minutes. And C, the lowercase c, is Rebecca, one of those women. So the form here is 95% of A are B. C is an A. So C is a B. This is, remember, the probability of this because it's statistical. So this is how we would write that form. 95% of A are B. So going back to what we saw here, 95% of A are B, C is an A. C is a B because of that 95%. So let's move along. So I want to bring that back there because that had our assignment there.
Sawyer Stash says, the legal seed. This established the precedent that a corporate charter could override an Aboriginal title. If the company says you are a colored or a laborer, your original noble lineage, like.
All right, waiting for it to continue here. Indeed, established corporate charter. All right. Anyways, we'll be on call for the rest of that post. In the meantime, let's move to the next slide. So we have contradictory conclusions. Here's a problem. 95% of women over 30 cannot run a mile in under 5 minutes. Rebecca's a woman over 40. So Rebecca cannot run the mile under 5 minutes. But now, what if we had this way? 80% of women over 30 marathoners can run a mile in under 5 minutes. Rebecca is a marathoner. So Rebecca can run a mile in under 5 minutes. So what we have here, same form, both have the exact same statistical syllogism form. Percentage of A or B. C is an A, so C is a B. But they get opposite conclusions. They reach contradictory conclusions. And our point here is that the form does not guarantee strength. So she either can or she can't, but depending on this here, the form, having 80% or 95%, it does not guarantee the strength of the argument, whether she does or not. If you asked everyone, you would end up hopefully with a similar percentage of respondents with what we're getting here, but that's just assuming that this statistical data is correct for the purposes of this. All right, let's get on to the fallacy of incomplete evidence. Here's our problem. When relevant evidence is omitted, an argument may appear strong, but is actually weak. They say they who withholds part of evidence with the intent to deceive is actually committing fraud, but I digress. Let's continue here. The form does not ensure strength, as we just saw. When does omission count as a logical error? Induction is a less tidy than deduction because we got to say when is it omission a logical error. So let's look at some cases here. There's evidence is readily available. The arguer is unaware. Is it excusable or culpable? So was it done on purpose? Did they have the means to find that evidence? Is it readily available? Or was it through investigation that the evidence was only available through effort, like going to the library? So the issue is under dispute among logicians. So think about that even as we were seeing earlier in the slides here, that deductive logic is pretty well mapped out, but there's a lot of unmapped areas when it comes to inductive logic. So let's proceed. That's why we try to follow things on the cutting edge here. So our common misconceptions. The false claim. As I'm just getting into the common misconception.
Great G5E says, thanks, Tribe, for hooking us up with the info to read, fuckers.
Indeed. Well, thanks for all of you participating in it. And again, this is something that it not only is going to benefit hopefully everyone here that's learning this, but also call it out as much as it's being used against people that are unwitting. All right, let's move along here. The common misconception is that deductive arguments proceed from general to specific, whereas inductive arguments proceed from specific to general. And the reality is that these characterizations are gross oversimplifications. So there are certain situations, so let's look at them. There are valid arguments that go from the general to the general. There are some valid arguments that go from specific to specific. And there are valid arguments that go from specific to general, depending on the counter examples here that we're going to get into. Then there's also strong arguments. Remember, this is our counterpart here for valid when it comes to inductive logic. The general to specific can be strong. A specific to specific argument can be strong, and so can a general to general. Let's get into some more detail here. So let's look at the examples of the valid arguments. Here's the general to general. So we talk about validity is typically, as we saw here in the last misconception, and if anyone paid attention in the high school indoctrination, then this was a something that you would have learned, that deductive arguments proceed from general to the specific. So you're deducing, you're taking away from a big stack until you get down to the specific, whereas inductive arguments proceed from specific, and then you build up to a general from those specifics. All right, but as we can see, those are misconceptions, as most things that were improperly taught. That's why I like to focus on the trivium elements here on this channel, because this is what was supposed to be taught in the first place. Here's some valid examples of valid arguments. All Shiites are Muslims. All Muslims are monotheists. Therefore, all Shiites are monotheists. That's a valid form. We also have a specific to specific. William of Ockham died in 1349. Bertrand Russell did not die in 1349. Therefore, they are not identical. See, this is a valid form. Not all that great useful, but perhaps in some situations it may be. Then we have specific to general. Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. Specific, then anyone, a very general one, anyone who voted for Roosevelt voted for a Democrat. That's a valid form. So, as we see here, the misconceptions shot down with counterexamples, which we do for deductive reasoning in general. Now we have here the strong argument counterexamples here. From general to specific. All lemons previously tasted have been sour. Therefore, the next lemon will be sour. So you went from a general, a bunch of things, very general, all the ones previously tested as very general, to specific, the next lemon. But it's still a strong argument. Next is specific to specific. Jeff Lyle is similar to Jeff Gossett. They both weigh 150 pounds. The CD player broke when Jeff sat on it. Therefore, the CD player will break if Jim sits on it, which is a strong argument. CD player. So we're getting dated here. Let's move on to this example here of the general to general strong argument. All 5 starters performed well throughout the season. All 5 have shown willingness to sacrifice. All 5 are experienced competitors. All 5 are rested and healthy. All 5 are highly motivated. A lot of general statements, and therefore they will perform well tomorrow. That's a strong argument. Heard that over and over. All right. So let's look at a summary of our key definitions here of inductive logic, because this is as deep as we really want to go on this, just to give you a basic outline and the distinction between deductive and inductive logic. So for inductive logic, we have the study of the methods for evaluating arguments for strengths and weaknesses. A strong argument is probable but not necessary that if premises are true, conclusion is true. Remember that 51% or 50 plus percent. Then there's the weak argument. It's not probable that if premises are true, conclusion is true. So that's less than 50%. And then we have the cogent argument. It's a strong argument in which all premises are true. So there's our clear definition for the cogent argument. It's a strong argument in which all the premises are true. And then there's the uncogent argument. It's either a weak argument, so a weak argument could be an uncogent argument, because cogent arguments are strong.
Craig for EG5, says, I've been waiting for cogent to show up.
Cogent 99. All right. So we have here the uncogent argument is either a weak argument or, so it could be a weak argument, uncogent, or a strong argument with at least one false premise. So the cogent in the terms of inductive logic, right? It's a strong argument which all the premises are true. But the uncogent argument is either a weak argument or it could be a strong argument, that high 90%, but at least one false premise that makes it uncogent, not weak. But if it's a weak, it is uncogent. So see how this works. All right, let's move along here. And this takes us to the best part of the presentation here, to our fun inductive logic quiz. And there still will be an extra special surprise at the end, so stay tuned. This one's going to be a little different format here because we get a few true and false, so we'll get 6 questions on this. So starting with question 1, and here's how we do it for this. We'll just start with put in the number of the question, the Arabic number here, like number 1, and then the letter T or F regarding which you're selecting for your answer, and disregard the shaded colors on the boxes. They aren't there to mislead or anything else. They just, I guess they came with the side colors here. That said, let's get down to it with question 1. If an argument is weak, then it is uncogent. True or false? If an argument is weak, then it is uncogent. True or false? Okay, so we could either Tango, Foxtrot, put your selection in after the number 1 for question 1. You have to put in that question.
4426 says 1F.
Okay, you sure about that? We'll move on to question 2. Anyone else takers on question 1? You can always enter them in. Just remember to put the number of the question because we got 4 of them here for true and false. All right, so let's go to question 2. If an argument is strong, it has only true premises, then it is cogent. So a strong argument, all the premises are true. Is it cogent? True or false? For question 2. Takers on questions 2. All right, we'll wait for that one. We're still going to move on to question 3, but you can answer question 2 anytime. If an argument is strong and has only true premises, then it is cogent. True or false? And we're moving on to question 3. If an argument is weak, then it must be invalid. True or false? And then we come on to question 4. Strong arguments always proceed from specific to general. It's question 4, true or false? Strong arguments always proceed from specific to general. As we saw there, a lot of misconceptions when it comes to
Pray for EG5E says, I think the blue box is legit. Try.
All right. We're going to move to, disregard those. They go with the thing here because the trues are always blue as this, and then the false has got this color here. So I think it's just part of the styling with the slide. Nevertheless, we're going to move on. So you get your questions 1, 2, 3, 4. We only got 1 taker on question 1. And we're going to move on to the next set, which are going to be multiple choice. So 5 and 6 here. Which of the following arguments have the form? We're looking at just the form of a statistical syllogism. Now we went over what makes the form of a statistical syllogism and which do not. Some of the arguments contain information that suggests a possible fallacy of incomplete evidence. So just be aware these are really tricky. Let's start with number 5 here. And again, you'll put in the number here, 5, the Arabic number, and then you'll place in the correct letter of your choice here for that question. 50% of marbles in container 3 are green. Just as tricky, there's container 3 is just its name. So 50% of the marbles in container 3 are green. The next marble to be drawn is a marble from container 3. Hence, the next marble to be drawn is green. So, which of the following have a statistical syllogism form? A, yes, it has the form. B, no, 50% is not between 50 and 100. C, no, it lacks a specific individual. Or D, no, the percentage is too high. So question 5. This should be a pretty easy one here. Any takers on question 5? And again, this is just, there's just to have a little fun participating in this.
4426 says 5B.
5B. Okay. Good answer. Anyone else wants to take a stab at question 5? We're going to move on to question 6, but you can still answer into question 5 as we read along. Jack is 65 years old. So Jack is not currently making a living as a professional boxer. So does this have the form of a statistical syllogism? Yes, it has a form. B, no, it's not a statistical syllogism. C, no, the conclusion is not general enough. Or D, no, it lacks a percentage. So again, Jack is 65 years old. That's pretty specific. So Jack is not currently making a living as a professional boxer. Another specific there. All right, so question 6. A, yes, it has a form. B, no, it is not a statistical syllogism. Or C, no, the conclusion is not.
Ultimate 4426 says 6B.
6B. All right. Any other takers for question 6? We're going to move on to the answers. All right, let's start with question 1. If an argument is weak, then it is uncogent. And that was true. That we went over that a weak argument or a strong one with at least one.
Ultimate 4426 says correction 6D.
Oh, we're not going to take that. 6 was B. You were right. So let's move along here. We'll go back to question 6 then. Jack is 65 years old. So Jack is not currently making a living as a professional boxer. Statistical syllogism. Remember, is this a statistical syllogism? It's not a statistical syllogism unless it's taken as enthematic, meaning that there's something that was left out that was implied. You know, the enthymeme with a tacit assumption. I love they use these great words. Enthematic with a tacit assumption of unstated premise that, okay, so what they're trying to say here is that this is just being implied, that most 65-year-old men do not make a living as professional boxers. So if you said most, Jack is 65 years old, and you would have to say that, or start out with, or maybe start with the statement, most 65, more than 50%, right, of 65-year-old men do not make a living as professional boxers. Jack is 65 years old, so Jack is not currently making a living as a professional boxer. That would make it a statistical syllogism. All right, so let's move on to the other true and false questions. On question 2, if an argument is strong and has only true premises, then it is cogent. And indeed, yes. Cogent argument is a strong argument with all true premises. And number 3, if an argument is weak, then it must be invalid. And that's true because weak argument by definition does not provide sufficient probabilistic support. So it must be invalid if it's weak. And question 4, strong arguments always proceed from specific to general. And that's false, as we saw before, because strong arguments can go general to specific.
Craig Curry G5E says, it's crazy when you see the answers, they make so much sense.
And that's the whole point of it, is that this type of especially inductive logic is an acquired skill, and only by doing these kinds of exercises can you acquire it. I mean, there are the few that might intuitively be able to pick this stuff up, but they're few and far between. All right, so let's go on to the, so this is a false one here, as we see here. The misconception is that the strong arguments have to proceed in a particular way, but they do not. All right, let's get on to the question 5, that 50%. There's an exact 50% of marbles in the container are 3. In container 3 are green. So if there's 100 marbles, 50 of them are green. The next marble to be drawn is a marble from container 3. Hence, the next marble to be drawn is green. So what's the probability of that? 50-50. So in a statistical syllogism, the percentage is greater than 50 and less than 100. So it can't be absolute and it can't be a toss-up. Why is a 50 important? It's a baseline. We're going to get to that in just a moment. So stick with me here. And we just went through number 6, with Jack being 65 years old, and why it's not a statistical syllogism. So really briefly, I want to get on to an example here where we talk about in statistical syllogisms why that 50% as being a baseline. And I thought one good example would be in guitar amplifiers. And from a time probably gone as we can remember, but at the introduction of guitar amplifiers, we had Class A and Class B later on with transistors. Now,
Craig Curry G5E says, "Why have I been retarded all my life?"
no, it's humans are the only ones intelligent enough to be tricked to be stupid. It's not your fault; it's a circumstance. Nevertheless, if we look at this graph here, and just stick with me, it's not as complicated as it might look, but the zero's way down here, and we have our waveform here. This is your sound wave coming out of the guitar amp. And notice that this baseline, the center, is at 2. So if we're going from 0 to 4 volts, right, you can almost think of this as 0 to 100, and this being the 50, okay? That you see the waveform in going on both negative
Bill
and
Clemens
positive.
4426 says, "The fool imagines they are wise, but the wise man knows he is a fool." Shakespeare.
Indeed. Great quote from Shakespeare, and quite a few at that. Nonetheless, if you just follow me here on this chart here, so this dotted line in the middle is your baseline. Okay, we call it a DC bias in the electronic world, but that's not the point here. Think of it as a 50% line. As you see, it's 50% of this area here. And this is our signal coming through here. We have the compression and rarefication, whatever you want to say is going on here. But nonetheless, we have two different opposites here. But there's a smooth transition, infinite transition between different parts of the waveform. All of it's preserved because all of it is above the zero, the inertia point. Now what we have here is the Class B operation. On a normal signal, there's not an issue here. As we see here, we have the top portion of this is actually starts at 0 volts at the positive portion of the waveform. The negative waveform, then it's taken over by another stage to amplify only the negative part of that same waveform. So the waveform passes through, there's two different transistors, a NPN, negative, positive, and a positive, negative, positive, which are the amplifiers in place of the tubes. And this allows it to take one half of the signal at a time. And there's a crossover point. When everything's going great, that's great. But here's where the problem lies. And here's where the logic breaks down too. So as you see here with a Class A, the tube amplifier, which starts at, has a baseline at 2 volts and 0 volts is well below any kind of signal. Here we see when you start to press oversaturate it through this level, it gives a soft saturation. They call it a smooth, nice tone distortion. Problem with the Class B when you do this, when they start to go and they get to push, you see there's gets to be a peaking of this part of the curve on the left, and then there's a transition part at the baseline. I should be having a little cursor here, shouldn't I? Let me get a little cursor here. So yeah, there we go. I'll get a little something so you can see what I'm pointing at. Try to. All right, that's good enough. So we can see here in this area here that we have a jagged edge. That's because it has to break the inertia of 0. This is a point of inertia for the next stage to take over, just to get the so-called, in whatever better words, the electrons ramped up to move to the next stage. It's not a smooth roll because these are just hit hard and they have to come down hard, and there's a hard stop. But what this results in is an absence. While it's at inertia, there's nothing being processed. And what are we losing in this little part? Imagine this being a bell curve of frequencies. Well, yeah, there's a few of them, but in that small area is where there's a lot of definition and detail. And what those are called are harmonic or partial structures. So we have these higher order harmonics or partials that get lost in a Class B during this crossover. You see in the Class A how high it is for the first partial here. This should be odd number partials. That should be 3, 5, 7, and 9. At 9, they would be at parity. So this is the partials here. That's the 3, the 5, 7, and then 9. And then on the other side here, you can see that very little of those higher order partials are there. at 9 is about where they equalize, and then you have some very high ones here, which are not really sonically necessary. So as you see here, in this type of compensation here, in that kind of error, you lose detail. And I think what the takeaway from this is that in deductive logic, there is no subtle details of crossovers, and there's no dead zones. Everything is very absolute and logical. But when we get into the inductive logic, even the smallest details, the smallest edge of this bell curve here is where the problem lies. And it takes, a very fine skill in deductive and inductive reasoning to flesh these things out and to have effective argument and dialogue for resolution. So with that, I hope that made some sense and I didn't get too technical and take you guys on too far of a path off track. But I thought when I was thinking that 50%.
Ultimate 4426 says, Nyquist says you must sample enough to get the details right. Craig Curry G5E says Tribe hooks us up with a special treat. Quiz we must be in happy hour.
Indeed. Yeah, this is your musical treat here without the music, but this is what makes it possible. And believe me, in some of the it's almost a black art of electronics to come up with this type of stuff to make it actually sound good. Trust me. This type of soft saturation curve here retains so much information, and I think having effectively smoothly designed inductive arguments performs the same type of function. It preserves more of the truth, whereas deductive arguments do it by their structure and form. That's absent in inductive reasoning.
Ultimate 4426 says, the power of the signal is the root mean square of the peak-to-peak amplitude for a smooth sine wave. Nerd.
There you go. Yeah, we could go all day with this, but the formulas and such are where it starts to lose most people. I thought the graph would help show because when you start to look at this, and I could probably zoom in on this a little bit more just to show you where I'm really trying to get at on this one here. Let me zoom in a little bit more. On this graph here, where you could really see the faults of the push-pull here, meaning that it's not being completely addressed in every respect, and that the breakaway here. But if we just looked at this portion here, let's see here, what's going on with this thing? Can't see that. All right, well, good enough. If you just think of this left portion here, never mind. Want to know why this bar's so big? I could change it. Yeah, it's not doing anything. Here we go. Here, what do you know? There we go. Okay, so if you just think of this portion here of one bell curve, and that at the end here, it's missing a good chunk of the very end of it. At the very end, yeah, there's the outliers, but they still count. And when it comes to detail and have distinction from one curve to the next, things like a wave front and this crossover point are what matters. Because again, who's to say that the real beauty of whatever it might have been wasn't in that section there? And if you saw it from the there we go, on this curve here, that it would have been sound a lot better. What's going on there? There we go. As you see here, there's that crossover point. No problem, because it doesn't have to come to a stop at zero. There's no inertial stop of the momentum of the waveform, which is really just a transfer of signal and data. This is just an absence of data is what that flat really represents. And then it's manifest, as we saw here, when we get down to the graphs here, as the partials being missed entirely here on this Class B amplifier. Now, there's better circuitry now that kind of compensates for this, but this is the principle, and yeah, the workarounds are the exception. But by preserving everything, by keeping it at a high level and never letting it rest to inertia, not leaving things absent, especially even the smaller details, that we can enhance the arguments and retain, preserve truth throughout even inductive arguments, and hopefully to the level of deductive arguments. Now that I've gone on enough on that, I want to take this one to the end and thank you all for attending. And I hope you learned a little bit from this in inductive logic. And it kind of cuts us to the end of this textbook, I believe. So if there's maybe another chapter to it, we'll do that too. But we've really covered a lot in the power of logic. And I hope that helps all of you in your understanding of logic and its application in our day-to-day lives as we deal with all kinds of dialogues and questions and answers. With that said, salute to you all, and I hope to see you on the next one. Peace out.
Field Image 4426 says take care all.